The world uses approximately 50 billion metric tons of sand and gravel every year. This figure is worth sitting with for a moment. 50 billion metric tons. It is more than the annual extraction of any other resource on Earth, including fossil fuels. It is by weight more than humanity extracts of coal, more than we extract of iron, or more than we extract of everything else combined. Sand is the primary ingredient of concrete, which is a material from which the modern-built world is constructed. It is the primary ingredient of glass. It is an essential material in the production of silicon chips. It is used to filter water, to manufacture paper, to create artificial beaches, to expand territory. Singapore has expanded its total land area by approximately 25% since independence using sand dredged from neighboring seabeds. It is the second most consumed natural resource on Earth after water. And it is, in growing regions of the global construction economy, the subject of violent criminal competition that has cost journalists their lives, corrupted law enforcement agencies, and local governments across 3 continents, destroyed some of the most ecologically significant river ecosystems on the planet, and created criminal organizations whose sophistication and violence rival those of the most established drug trafficking networks. The global sand crisis, the gap between the demand for the specific type of sand that the construction industry requires and the sustainable supply of that sand from accessible deposits, is driving this criminal market, and the criminal market is making the ecological consequences of sand extraction dramatically worse. The ecological dimension of the sand scarcity problem begins with a fact that strikes most people as counterintuitive: desert sand, of which the world has enormous quantities, is useless for construction. The grains of desert sand have been tumbled by wind over millions of years until they are nearly spherical. When mixed with cement to make concrete, smooth round grains do not bond effectively. The resulting concrete lacks the structural integrity that angular, irregular grains provide when they lock together. Construction-grade sand comes primarily from rivers, riverbeds, and floodplains, where water erosion breaks rock into irregular fragments whose jagged surfaces create the interlocking matrix that gives concrete its strength. River sand is not uniformly distributed, not inexhaustibly abundant, and not rapidly replenished. Rivers produce sand through geological processes that operate on timescales of thousands of years. The global construction boom, driven overwhelmingly by urbanization in Asia, where China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and their neighbors are building cities for the hundreds of millions of people moving from rural to urban settings each decade, is extracting river sand at rates that dramatically exceed natural replenishment. The Mekong River, which supports the livelihoods and food security of approximately 70 million people across Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar, has been progressively mined for sand across its length. Satellite analysis shows the river's bed has dropped measurably in multiple locations, with the bed of the lower Mekong in Vietnam having dropped by an average of approximately 1 meter over recent decades. The consequences cascade through the entire river system. Lower water tables adjacent to the river reduce agricultural productivity, reduce sediment delivery to the Mekong Delta, one of the most productive agricultural regions in Southeast Asia, causes subsidence and saltwater intrusion, and reduced river depth affects fisheries that are a primary protein source for millions of people. The organized criminal dimension of illegal sand mining varies in character and scale across different regional contexts, but several documented cases illustrate how sophisticated and violent the industry can become. In India, which has some of the world's most aggressive and best documented sand mafias, criminal networks have been linked to the murders of at least a dozen journalists and environmental activists investigating illegal mining operations in states including Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, and Punjab. The networks operate with protection from local politicians and police officials who receive regular payments to ignore illegal mining or to actively obstruct enforcement. The scale of Indian illegal sand mining is enormous. Estimates suggest that illegal mining may account for the majority of all sand extracted in some states, with illegal permitted extraction representing a small fraction of actual removal. Organized fleets of trucks operate through the night, extracting sand from riverbeds at volumes that collapse riverbanks, undermine bridge foundations, and damage irrigation infrastructure. In some documented cases, bridges and rural roads have been physically destroyed by the erosion of the riverbanks they were built on, following the removal of the sand that stabilized those banks. The journalist Sandeep Sharma, who had been investigating sand mining operations in Madhya Pradesh, was killed in March of 2019 when a sand-laden truck drove over him. He had been receiving death threats related to his reporting. His case is among the most prominent of a pattern of journalist killings connected to sand mining investigations that human rights organizations and press freedom groups have documented across India and in other heavily mined countries. In Vietnam, the sand mining situation along the Mekong and Cue Long rivers has been investigated extensively by both Vietnamese authorities and international researchers. The Vietnamese government has periodically conducted enforcement campaigns against illegal dredging operations, but the structural economic pressures that drive the operations, the enormous profit margins on extracted sand, the ready market in Ho Chi Minh City's construction industry, and the geographic difficulty of monitoring thousands of kilometers of river have limited the effectiveness of these campaigns. The physical consequences in Vietnam are among the most thoroughly documented of any major sand mining region. The Mekong Delta, which sits at the mouth of the river system and whose elevation above sea level depends on the continued delivery of sediment from upstream, is measurably sinking. The subsidence results from a combination of reduced sediment supply, because the sand and gravel that previously reached the delta is being intercepted upstream, and the extraction of sand from the delta itself. Combined with sea level rise, the subsidence is affecting the long-term habitability of a region where millions of people live and one of Southeast Asia's most productive agricultural areas is located. In West Africa, particularly in Sierra Leone, Senegal, Gambia, and Ghana, sand extraction from beaches and coastal areas is destroying the coastal infrastructure of communities that depend on beaches for tourism and fishing, exposing coastal settlements to erosion and storm surge, and in some cases literally removing the land on which communities stand. The sand extracted from West African beaches moves through brokers to construction markets in the Gulf states and elsewhere, tracing a supply chain that is largely invisible at the consumption end. The regulatory and enforcement challenges associated with illegal sand mining share structural features with other illicit resource extraction industries, with some features specific to sand's physical characteristics. Sand is extremely difficult to trace once it enters legitimate supply chains. Unlike timber or wildlife products, which retain species or origin characteristics that forensic analysis can sometimes identify, processed construction sand is visually and chemically generic. Sand from a legally mined river cannot typically be distinguished from legally sourced sand once it has been mixed, processed, and incorporated into concrete. This traceability problem means that the enforcement pressure must be applied at the extraction stage, catching the mining operation, rather than at the processing or retail stage. Extraction stage enforcement requires either aerial and satellite monitoring to identify illegal dredging activity, physical presence on rivers to intercept illegal operations, or the kind of community-based reporting and documentation that has been undertaken by journalists and NGOs in heavily mined regions, often at significant personal risk. The enforcement agencies in many of the most heavily affected countries face structural incentive problems. The financial flows from illegal sand mining generate payment streams that corrupt local officials and police, and the communities most affected by mining are typically among the poorest and least politically powerful. The beneficiaries of illegal extraction tend to have stronger political connections than the communities that bear its costs. The global construction economy's dependence on river sand, a resource whose extraction, at the current scale and in the current manner, is causing measurable ecological harm to some of the most important river systems on Earth, represents a structural problem that has no simple solution. Substitute materials exist and are being developed. Manufactured sand, produced by mechanically crushing rock, can replace natural river sand in many concrete applications and is used at significant scale in several countries. Marine sand, extracted from offshore seabed deposits rather than rivers, is used in some markets. Recycled concrete aggregate from demolished buildings can partially substitute for virgin aggregate. Each of these alternatives has its own cost, environmental footprint, and performance characteristics that make them more or less appropriate for specific applications. The trajectory of demand, driven by continued urbanization in Asia and Africa, is unlikely to decrease significantly on any near-term horizon. The trajectory of supply from sustainably managed sources is constrained by the biological and geological reality of how slowly rivers produce the material being consumed. The violence, corruption, and ecological destruction that fills the gap between sustainable supply and actual demand is the direct consequence of that arithmetic. The sand underfoot is not unlimited. The sand mafias exist because the market does not price this fact, and they will continue to exist until it does.